Yeah.
You get to sit in the very front. All right. The best seats, right?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wolverine Caucus. We like to think that the Wolverine Caucus, as we mentioned, is the University of Michigan's way of helping to change the world one forum at a time. We're excited that all of you are here to hear about a most provocative topic, one that is very timely, especially in the last few weeks, even at the University of Michigan, as some of you may have heard. I am pleased to share that these forums are provided to us by the Alumni Association as well as the Office of the Vice President for Government Relations. And we're pleased that we're joined today by State Representative Adam Zemke. And the speaker is going to be introduced by one of our favorite people, who's former State Representative Paul Clementi. His wife is current State Representative Cara Clementi, and she couldn't be here because of being in committee at this time. But isn't it fantastic that state legislators want to come back to be a part of this process? So I'll let him tell you more about his life as a state representative in Lincoln Park and all of the great things that he and his family are doing that certainly speak well for the University of Michigan. So without further ado, I want to introduce State Representative Paul Clementi.
Well, as usual, it's a pleasure to be back in front of the Wolverine Caucus. You know, now instead of as a state rep, I guess a first husband of a state rep. You know, it's very nice when you finish being a state rep. I was actually able to change my LinkedIn bio from state representative back to what it was previously, which is I'm most comfortable with, which is trophy husband / male model. Still haven't done too well with that yet, but also when Kara mentioned who was going to be here today, it immediately hit me that I've heard what area he's focusing on, which is the computer science engineering area. and it hit me that my son, who was in the back, who was at U of M, just declared his major as a computer science engineer. So I said, Joseph, please stand up for 1 second, Joseph. And not just he's my son, bright young guy, and he does have my sense of humor, which is great. So I'm very proud to have him here today to listen. So, who do we have today? Well, the gentleman we have today has a specialty that, like we were saying, has just been, just seems to be in the media every day. So this gentleman, his name is J. Alex Halderman. He prefers to be called Alex, and he's a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan. And he's the director of the Center for Computer Security and Society. His interests include computer and network security, internet security measurement, censorship resistance, and electronic voting, as well as the interaction of technology with politics and international affairs, which that's the first time I've ever heard that happening. So I guess what I would say is that he's the gentleman who develops a smarter mousetrap. Unfortunately, we end up getting smarter mice, so we have to. It's a continuous arm and war. So it's a pleasure to have him here. He was named by Popular Science as one of the best and brightest new minds in the computer science and engineering world. So please, if you could welcome J. Alex Halderman today to the Wolverine Caucus.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm just going to stand in front of the podium today, if that works for people, and if you can hear me in the back. This is how I like to lecture, and I'm not used to giving the maybe the Lansing style of speech. I'm more one to like to have a conversation. So please also feel free to interrupt if you have questions, and we will have plenty of time for questions at the end. So today I want to talk about cybersecurity and elections. And we had an election quite recently. I think most of you will remember 3.5 months ago we had this election, and this was the result. So Donald Trump won in a victory that was to many people surprising. You can remember the polls before the election. 538 was predicting a victory for Hillary Clinton. So was the New York Times. So was the Princeton Election Consortium, where Sam Wong promised to eat a bug if Trump received more than 240 electoral votes. Nearly everyone predicted a win for Hillary Clinton. And then this happened. Sam Wong polls were almost uniformly wrong. So why was that? What happened? If we dissect this election outcome, we have an election that turned out to be, well, Clinton won the popular vote, but Trump won the Electoral College. He didn't win the Electoral College in a landslide. Actually, it was one of the narrower Electoral College victories. But what really happened? There were two ways to explain this outcome. There are two predominant theories that we might consider. And as a scientist, my work is about considering hypotheses and looking for evidence to confirm or reject them. And what we see here in the 2016 presidential election, there are two hypotheses that seem at all credible to explain the deviation from the polls. Either systematic error in the polls, which is what Nate Silver and others in the polling industry immediately started reporting, or that the results were rigged, that there was some kind of fraud that contributed to this divergence, which was what candidate Trump advocated before the election, that he expected that there would be widespread fraud on the ground. So that probably is not what happened. And I say that as for a number of reasons, even though, including that explanation A here, is reasonably credible and fits with the facts reasonably well. And yet, the possibility of widespread fraud, especially fraud mediated by computers in the election process, is one that I think is a strong enough possibility that it requires some analysis of the election to either gather further evidence for it or to refute that possibility. I don't think that we could ever know, based on first principles, for sure, which of these two explanations was correct. And that's what I want to talk about today. Is rigging a presidential election through computer technology actually feasible? And how can we find out whether it's happened and prevent it from happening in the future? So to talk about that, I want to go back a little bit, a couple of steps, and talk about how voting happens in America. How are elections administered? So election technology in the United States is a patchwork. We have this brilliant federalist system, and one of the consequences of that is that each state individually regulates most aspects of the conduct of elections, including the choice of which specific kind of polling technology to use. Even within individual states, decisions about what technology to use are sometimes left to counties. And so we have a system across the country. There are about 52 different models of computer voting technology in use in individual counties across the nation. There are two main styles of machines in use: optical scan machines, which is what we use in Michigan, where the voter fills out a ballot, scans it through a scanner, which is in fact a full computer that just has a device for reading pieces of paper. And then at the end of election day, that computer outputs a record of how many votes each candidate received, and also creates an electronic record, but we can get into that later. The other style of voting machine that's being used in large parts of the country is called direct recording electronic, or DRE. And this style of machine, the voter uses a touch screen or a similar interface to mark their ballot, and the primary record of the vote is stored in a file in the computer's memory, basically a database that the voting machine maintains. So are these voting machines secure? That's the critical question from my area of research in computer security, where our job is to ask what can go wrong and figure out how to stop it. Well, I and other security researchers have, over the past 10 years, performed basically tests, tear-down analyses of many of the voting systems used in the U.S. We get the voting machine into our laboratory, we pretend that we are the bad guys, and we see whether we can attack the machines. Well, in every single case where an American voting machine has been brought into the laboratory, researchers, including me, have found that we can infect that machine with malicious software that will steal votes, that will alter the electronic records of the election. This includes every model of DRE and every model of optical scanner that has been subjected to independent security testing. Every single case. Now the question is, can a bad guy get malicious software into enough of these voting machines to make a difference? And will they be caught? So what would it take to actually hack, say, a presidential election, the largest scale of election in the U.S.? Well, there were a couple of different things we might mean by hacking a presidential election. One is just trying to alter the results that are reported on election night. And that's something that's maybe more, that's easier to conceive of doing in some ways. I was saying before the election that I thought this was a serious risk. And the reason for that is that the initial results on election night are aggregated by the media using internet feeds from election authorities across the country. All of those systems are connected to the internet. It wouldn't be that hard to spread some false information on election night, but it would be caught. And it would be caught because we have very nice processes afterwards for reconciling the votes that were reported in each precinct with the state level totals. We would eventually catch that. But there is precedent for such an attack. In fact, in 2014 in Ukraine, attackers who are believed to be linked to Russia hacked into the Central Election Authority and rigged their systems so that the wrong results would have been reported. They basically tried to sabotage the system. This was reportedly caught just in time, but there was a real attempt to do that. So this is something that we do worry about happening, though it would be caught. Another possibility is to try direct political interference and just try to change how people voted. And if you believe the reports that have come out of the intelligence community at the end of the Obama administration, there was a deliberate attempt by Russia during the 2016 election to use selective hacking to spread information that would advantage one political party. Now, believe that or not, that is something that could be done. But there's another way that someone could try to change the outcome of a political election, and that's to directly attack the mechanics of voting, the voting machines themselves, to change those initial records of the votes. And this would be an attack where you try, your aim would be to silently change the election result and not get caught. And this is what I want to ask, is whether it's plausible or not. Now, there are three challenges you have to get around as an attacker to pull off a vote-stealing attack and change a presidential election outcome. One is the diversity of voting equipment on the ground. We have so many different kinds of machines that are administered by so many different people. So isn't that a defense? Well, it turns out that that diversity in a narrow election can work against us. Because if I'm an attacker, I can look at the polling data a month or so before the election. People have some idea where the close states are likely to be then. And using that poll data, I can try to direct my resources against attacking the states that are most likely to be determinative of the outcome. So as opposed to a central system where there's one place to attack that's either secure or not, in our system, in a close election, I, as the attacker, can choose whichever weakest states are likely to be close enough that shifting a small number of votes won't get me immediately detected. In 2016, it was the case that I would have needed to swap less than 1% of votes in just 2 states in order to flip the outcome. So I can pick whichever counties in those 2 states have the weakest security and attack there. All right, what's the second challenge? The machines themselves, and you've probably heard this, are not supposed to be connected to the internet. And I think in almost all cases this is true. They're not directly plugged in. So if I'm a remote attacker, say a foreign power that wants to manipulate U.S. Politics, how can I get at the machines? All right, well, the answer to this is surprising to many people. So while the voting machines themselves are not plugged into the internet, they do get the final ballot from somewhere, right? We need some other computer that's going to do the programming, that's going to tell the voting machines what the candidates are, what are the races. This is done on another system called an election management system. And often this is just a desktop computer that's maintained by, say, a county, and is going to be used to program all the voting machines over a wide area. These machines do need to be connected to the internet at least occasionally, because once again, the ballot design has to be programmed into them from somewhere. It's not the case in most instances that someone just keys in the ballot design. It comes from an external source. And these machines need to receive software updates, security fixes, all of the things your normal desktop computer would need. So if I'm an attacker and I can compromise, I can gain a foothold on some of these central election management computers, I can infect the data cards, the memory cards that are used to program the ballot design into individual voting machines. And I can do that over a wide area. All right, so the question now becomes, how easy is it to infect these central election management computers? Well, one surprising thing that I learned just since the election is that in Michigan, for instance, 75% of counties outsource the ballot programming to just 2 small businesses. These are approximately 20-person companies, and they provide election services, everything from the seals on the voting machines to I voted stickers, but also do programming. And here's one of these companies. These are unlikely to be the best secured companies in America. In fact, most small businesses do have problems with security. Here's their website for one of these companies. They show you nice photographs of their warehouse, of their computer systems, even a staff directory. So I'm not sure how many people have heard of a phishing attack, but this is one of the most common forms of attack there are. This is how the DNC and Podesta's email are thought to have been compromised. Basically, someone sends an email. They spoof an email. This is something I know a lot about. They spoof an email claiming to be from one person in the organization to another that says, urgently, you need to open this file or reset this password. And the victim receives this, believes it's genuine, clicks the link, and the link triggers something that causes malicious software to be installed on their computer. Now the bad guys have access to their computer. They have a foothold in the network. If I wanted to hack these people, I think I'd probably just go to their website and look at their company directory, see that the administrative assistant to the president is this woman, Sue. I'd click the link that says email Sue, and I'd forge an urgent message from her boss, Larry. I mean, they're giving away on their website all the information that I'm going to need to try to start tricking them into giving me a foothold into their network. And that's just an attack that works on almost everybody. All right, so the second challenge, even though the machines aren't connected to the internet, all I have to do is phish one of these two companies to get my malicious software onto the election management system and spread it to voting machines throughout a state like in large parts of the state. All right, there's one more challenge. After years of work today by technologists and election integrity advocates, about 70% of votes in the United States in 2016 were recorded with some form of physical evidence that is beyond the reach of computer attack. And in most cases, this just means there's a paper ballot. So why do we need paper when we have all this fancy computer technology? Well, it's the same reason that if you've flown on a commercial jet lately, it may have a high-tech satellite navigation system, but by law, it still has to have a magnetic compass. Why? It's a common-sense fail-safe, just in case the computers go haywire, there's interference, there's a bug, what have you. To make another analogy, it's the same way you want the brakes in your car to still work if the computer goes haywire. So your brakes also, there's some physical interlock between the brake pedal and the brakes. You don't want it to be entirely electronic, or if that system fails, you have a serious safety issue. Well, voting and elections are also a form of critical safety and security, national security critical infrastructure. And for the same reason, it's common sense that we need some form of physical safety mechanism involved. The simplest of these is just to have a piece of paper that the voter can see that's going to be out of reach of the computer system. So the voter knows their vote was recorded, and we can go back later and check to make sure that the computer records weren't later changed. We can couple paper records, because of course paper can be cheated on too, and we have, as far back as we've used paper in elections, there's been fraud that's involved paper. But with computerization now, we can have a computer record and a paper record, and as long as we check to make sure that they agree, an attacker would need to manipulate both of them to defraud us, and that's very difficult to manipulate them both in a way that agrees. All right, so about 70% of the country now, including all of Michigan, has paper records of votes. There's just one problem. In 2016, despite the election being close and despite it being surprising, practically no jurisdiction, absent the recounts that were requested by certain candidates, would have looked at sufficient paper to determine whether fraud occurred. Most of that paper, almost all of that paper, would just have been thrown away without looking at it. All right, so the answer is that attacking a presidential election would be easier than you thought. You can use polling data to predict states that will be relatively close, direct your attacks against them, target some of the election management systems, infect the machines from there, and most states, even if they do have paper, will just throw it away without looking at it. that's the unfortunate situation we're in. None of this is beyond the reach of realistic attackers today. You may have read about an attack called Stuxnet that was developed, according to the New York Times, by the US and the Israelis to sabotage the Iranian nuclear enrichment program. Stuxnet followed a pattern very similar to this. It was used to infect certain computers and then spread to the nuclear centrifuges, and then there was no evidence, no easy-to-find evidence left behind that could be used to trace the fact that we did it. All right, so in 2016, we had this circumstance where a narrow election, the possibility of rigging is certainly there. How do we find out whether the election result is genuine or not? This is the situation that I and other people in the election integrity research community were facing, as well as many others across the nation. And I wanted to know, as much as anyone else, whether we could examine some of the physical evidence of the election just to rule out the possibility of a cyber attack. And if there's no cyber attack, looking at it gives everyone increased confidence. If there was a cyber attack, we detect it and deter future attacks. It's as simple as that. But in the narrow time between election day and when the election result would be locked in under the law with the Electoral College, was there any opportunity to act? And so, as you may have heard, I was involved in discussions with other academics and advocates and the Hillary Clinton campaign shortly after the election, in which we asked them whether they would be willing to request certain audits in particular states to look for evidence of a potential cyber attack. Now, those conversations were interesting, but basically the Clinton campaign asked one question: where is the evidence that fraud occurred? And to me, that's a little bit backwards. We shouldn't be demanding evidence that fraud occurred before we look for the evidence of whether fraud occurred. The paper, the physical records are where the evidence will be. But that's what they were concerned about. And also they were concerned about backpedaling from the concession. Because you remember the third debate? Clinton and Donald Trump had this exchange in which Donald Trump refused to say that he would accept the election results on election night. Now, in fairness to him, there are two possible interpretations of that. One is he's saying he won't accept the democratic outcome of the election, and that's how Hillary Clinton interpreted it, and she called him a threat to American democracy. But a more charitable interpretation is he's saying he wants to wait until we examine the evidence and are sure the result is right, which is actually a position I would support. But after Clinton interpreted it that way and chastised him, I think she felt really boxed in about whether she would be able to now appear to be backpedaling. So it looked like that wasn't going to work. But then someone had the great idea that any candidate in many states seems to be eligible under the law to petition for a recount. And Jill Stein stepped forward. Now, Jill Stein had about 1% of the vote nationally. She was on the ballots in most states. Most importantly, she was willing, and at a fairly high political cost to herself among her own party, to champion a prophylactic recount for purposes of ensuring the integrity of the result. And so I'm going to skip over a little bit of this for time, but there was an unfortunate New York Magazine piece that many of you may have read that quoted, that was not based on fact, and quoted people as saying, I have some kind of secret evidence that the election had been rigged. And although I'm grateful that people place enough trust in me to think that if I'm saying that there's evidence that it was rigged, it was rigged, but there was no secret evidence. This is not based on fact. No, the evidence is whatever is in the ballot boxes. And so I published a piece on Medium that also has been quite widely read that made the case for recounting as a security measure, regardless of whether you think the election had been hacked before or not. Anyway, it was an amazing experience with the recounts, and I think it testifies to how much concern there is over a broad segment of the population about the integrity of elections. In just 2 days, the Stein Recount campaign raised $5 million from more than 160,000 donors ultimately in order to support the recount efforts. That is more money than she raised for her entire presidential campaign, incidentally. All right. So we decided to petition for recounts in 3 states, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and in Michigan. We picked these states because they were ones that, just as a matter of trying to think about how we rule out the hypothesis that the election outcome was changed by fraud. So in order to do that, we want to start with the places that had narrow margins, that were in favor of the apparent winner, and that had a mechanism under the law for us to try to get a recount. There were other close states. Like New Hampshire and Virginia that it wasn't feasible for us to attempt to recount for legal reasons. So let me see. Where do we go from here? On November 25th. Yes.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that Jill Stein acted completely on her own, or was she urged to put in the recount?
Well, I urged her. So, yes, I can say she was urged. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
So 3 states that you just pointed out,
Yeah.
Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, are they from different of those head companies, those 2 that you said?
They are largely programmed by different companies, by a diversity of different companies. They use a range of different technologies, and they're all a nice representative sample, actually. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Going back a little bit to the pollster,
Yeah.
don't they take into account that people just lie? I mean, because we're looking at this election, and especially with the language that he was using that was so polarizing, there might have been a stigma if you said, yeah, I'm voting Trump. And so when people call and ask you, say, no, I'm not going to vote for him, so therefore the poll is wrong.
They are supposed to take that into account. In fact, the science of polling is largely about trying to correct for people's willingness to express their opinion, and for the demographics of your sample, and for other factors like that. Unfortunately, the polling business, which is a large and quite a well-developed business now, that industry got it wrong. Yes?
Were those polls taken before or after Comey made his statement right before the election?
Those snapshots were pretty close to the election. I don't remember the exact date that the screenshots I showed you were from. Yeah. Well, there are a lot of things that led into change of opinion, yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So let's see. The president elect said a bunch of nasty things about the recounts, and it made for an interesting Thanksgiving when I was home with family, and we had the president-elect going on a long series of tweets about how crooked the recount effort was. He was not a fan. And ultimately, he and his lawyers would oppose efforts to recount in all 3 of these states. Okay, but let me show you just briefly, what does a recount look like? It looks like this, and this is in Washtenaw County, where I went and volunteered as an observer and watched the process. It's nothing like what you saw in Florida in 2000, where it was a completely different kind of technology, punch card ballots. Recounting optical scan ballots like we use in Michigan is merely tedious, but it's a fairly accurate process. You have 2 workers from the county who examine every ballot and go through the stack and sort them by which candidate was marked. Then they go through each of those stacks and count how many ballots is in it. All this takes place in front of observers who aren't allowed to talk but are allowed to raise objections if they see something wrong. All right, a recount also looks like this. Numerous lawsuits flying about. There were, at one point, I think we had 7 suits happening in parallel in state and federal courts and county level legal efforts at the same time across the 3 states. There are ample opportunities for the apparent winner to challenge the process and try to prevent a recount from happening. And indeed, that's what happened in Michigan. So a recount also looks like this. This is a protest here in Lansing that I attended. These are supporters of the recount effort asking the Michigan Supreme Court to allow it to proceed. It also looks like this, and like this, and like this, like this, and like this. So it was a whirlwind few weeks. But then the election was decided, and in fact the Electoral College met, and Donald Trump is our president. But what do we know from the recount efforts? What can we take from the experience in these 3 states? Well, in Wisconsin, the outcome was that Wisconsin recounted every ballot in the state. The courts allowed the recount to proceed. There was just one problem, which is that it was up to each individual county whether to count the votes by hand or to run them through the optical scanners again. Which, if those scanners had been compromised, they might still be compromised and might just continue to commit fraud. The net change across Wisconsin, in Wisconsin, interestingly, more votes changed than the margin of victory, but they changed in ways that canceled each other out. So the net change was just 397 votes. In Michigan, after a series of legal battles, it was determined that Jill Stein was not aggrieved, and so the recount that started was halted. About 43% of the total votes cast were recounted by the time the recount was halted, and there was no evidence of a widespread attack. In Pennsylvania, well, it's almost impossible to recount elections in Pennsylvania, it turned out. You'd need multiple voters from each precinct to swear under oath that they had evidence that the election outcome had been changed by fraud. And even then, in most of Pennsylvania, there's no physical record, so there would be nothing to recount. So in Pennsylvania, only 1 county ended up doing a recount, and they have not announced the results. We can presume that there was no evidence of fraud. However, we did find some interesting things. In Detroit, there were widespread problems on the ground with precincts where there were either too many ballots, too few ballots, or broken seals. And under Michigan law, in these conditions, the precinct is ruled unrecountable. You're not allowed to go and examine the content of the ballots again. And this was a systematic problem across much of the Detroit metro area. Now, why could this happen? One plausible explanation is that this is just old and out-of-date equipment and underfunded operations, incompetence. Another potential explanation is fraud, because if I'm on the ground, I want to tinker with the electronic results and prevent those from being ever spotted. Well, I just have to break a seal. I don't have to actually change any of the ballots in the ballot box. That makes it really easy. This is a consequence of the laws about recounting in Michigan predating computerization. If the ballots were already inspected by people once, no reason to go look at them again if there's evidence that they may have been tampered with. But on the other hand, if we're using hand counting as a way to detect a cyber attack, well, you do want someone to look at the ballots at least once. All right, so this gets us to the question, what did we learn from all of this? Does this give us reason to believe the election outcome was genuine or not? And what we'd actually want to conduct, if we could do whatever we wanted to try to gather evidence that to rule out a cyber attack, the obvious thing we would want is something called a statistical risk limiting audit. The idea here is that you don't actually have to look at every ballot in the state to know whether the outcome was affected by cyber attack. You just need to look at enough ballots to have a large enough statistical sample that you have high confidence in the outcome. Right? If you look at a large enough sample, you'll know with 99% confidence that if you looked at all the ballots, you would get the same result. That's called a risk limiting audit. Unfortunately, we didn't have a random sample. in Michigan or in Pennsylvania, in the states that didn't do a complete recount? Why didn't we ask for just a risk limiting audit, by the way? Well, because there's no legal mechanism to do that. The candidate can ask for a recount or not. Anyway, we didn't have a random sample, so how do we interpret what we get from the limited and selected samples in these states? One way to think about this, and we actually don't have complete data about the Michigan recount yet. The precinct level data has not yet been published by the state. But we can do a very rough cut analysis based on county level data, and even just starting with a very rough kind of statistical model, and get some preliminary results. This is something that I and other researchers are actively working on refining now as we await the data. What we can do is, one thing we can do is we can posit some scenarios. How many counties would an attacker need to change in order to change the election outcome in the state? And then how likely would it be that an attack of that size would have been detected by the recounts that occurred? What we get with a very basic form of this analysis, to give you an example, and I repeat this as preliminary, is in Wisconsin, we might, under this kind of hypothetical attack scenario, have detected a recount with about an attack with about 95% probability. In Michigan, maybe a little bit more than 80%, and in Pennsylvania, less than 10%, because the recount was so incomplete. So I think that this gives us reason for additional confidence in the election outcome, at least with respect to large-scale cyber attacks aimed at influencing the outcome. This doesn't allow us to say conclusively that the outcome was not changed by an attack, but whatever you thought before, you need to think that it's somewhat less probable introducing this evidence to your other mix of facts. So it supports the integrity of this election. At the same time, we learned that elections would be all too easy to attack. And given the background, given the rise of state-level attackers, given the hidden centralization of election machine programming, we need to act now to make sure that the next election is not influenced by a cyber attack. Hacking an election, easier than you thought, but what can we do to prevent it? Well, there are three things that need to happen. One, we need to harden the election technology and fix the obvious problems. That's my department. That's what we're trying to do on the computer security side. But two, we need to reintroduce paper records of some form for every vote, just so that we have some form of quality control. It seems to me like a common sense defense, and it's one of the cheapest defenses against a cyber attack on critical infrastructure that I've ever heard of. Old-fashioned and simple, introducing paper records, and more importantly, because Michigan already has them, making sure that where we do have paper records, we look at them instead of throwing them away. We need to have risk-limiting audits done routinely in federal elections in every state. This is a low-cost mechanism, much easier than a full recount, and just as likely to detect cyber attack. These are simple fixes that we could have in place by 2018 or 2020 if we start now, but it's going to require action by the states or action by the federal government to make it happen. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit more about the first bullet, about hardening voting technology? What does that mean?
Sure. So there are a few things that we can do. The technology itself, unfortunately, has as I said, every voting machine that's been inspected by independent qualified security experts has been found to have bugs that allow malicious software to be introduced. The fact is, almost all software has bugs that allow malicious software to be introduced. The question is, how expensive are they to find? And there was a lot of low-hanging fruit in American voting machines. What we need to harden them to make it more expensive and challenging to attack them is largely about transparency. It's about setting security testing requirements that are meaningful. Is about making sure that the technology that's in use on election day has been well enough vetted. But no amount of that is going to allow us to know 100% that there isn't vote-stealing software in the machines. That's because, well, they're computer systems. The last person to touch that software on its way into the machine may have changed it to make it malicious. we can't know for sure that the software running in the machines was supposed to be there. Yeah.
Kind of following up on that same question, when you said that you were able to successfully hack them in a laboratory setting. So how does the laboratory setting translate to the real world? That, you know, in a laboratory, you can there's a lot you can do in a lab, but how much of it is practical?
Well, definitely. So, in some ways, the laboratory setting, as you're implying, is more favorable to the attackers. Like, among other things, we don't have to worry about being caught and going to jail. We also usually assume that we have some mechanism for introducing the malicious software into the pipeline in the first place, say momentary access to one of these memory cards, the ability to use a phishing attack to hack into the central election management system. Those are usually the assumptions that make sense. On the other hand, we also have far fewer resources than a typical, a foreign government intelligence agency. None of us are professional attackers. Usually these studies are conducted by academics who, for their day job, do things other than searching for vulnerabilities in computer software. And yet, nonetheless, we as armchair academics can find exploitable vulnerabilities in the voting machine software. That's pretty scary to me. If I had the resources of a state intelligence agency, I could almost certainly do much better. Yes?
So, did the Russians hack us, or is that just a story? And my problem is, what's wrong with our guys if they couldn't stop them? That's scarier than if we can't stop them, we're not the upper hand.
Well, so I can't, I will say that I personally find the intelligence reports credible, but I don't have the classified intelligence on which they're based, so there's not any way for me to form an opinion beyond what we've all read in the newspaper. I think it's fully plausible that there was, that the attacks we saw in the run-up to the election with the leaked email were politically motivated.
So, I'm sorry.
Just really quick, yeah.
I'm sorry, I forgot my question.
We can talk afterwards. Yes?
Isn't it difficult to enact your reforms because the elections have to be run by each state?
It is difficult because each state, either we need federal legislation to enact election standards that go significantly beyond what we've seen the federal government impose before, or we need action on the state level across many different states.
Is there a standard bill that is out there, for states to use?
I don't believe there is, and I agree that that's something that would be a nice product of the policy process. Yes? Yeah, that would be a nice product of the policy process. Michigan, frankly, is so close to being where we need to be on this issue. We have machines. There's now an effort to upgrade some of the machines that were most in need of refreshing just to keep functioning. We have paper. We just need to look at that paper routinely.
Is there a retention requirement for the paper ballot?
There's a federal retention requirement until sometime in the, pardon?
6 years.
6 years. 6 years? Yeah. The 6-year federal requirement. Yeah.
You have to keep the paper record for 6 years?
You have to store them for 6 years. Yeah. Yes.
Well, all you're talking about is involving computers and so on.
Yeah.
What about multiple voting by a person and non-citizen voting? Is there any way of looking at that?
So in my mind, we should be looking at all threats to the security of the election. There's no more evidence for that happening on a large scale than there's evidence that past elections have been changed by large-scale hacking. But I agree with you that we should be making sure that we're securing all aspects of the electoral process.
Well, I could assume that votes cast matched up with voting records, but who created those voting records, And way in the past,
Yeah.
you walk in with a driver's license, they signed you up to vote.
Well, the president-elect has been, the president has been calling for a thorough investigation of this, and I would like to see a thorough investigation of all aspects of election
But
security.
it'd be very difficult.
We have the records, so I think especially, another question is about absentee voting,
Right.
and whether absentee ballots may be manipulated at large scale in order to commit fraud. That's another thing I would add to that concern. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that you, I guess, advocated that Dr. Stein go ahead and pursue this.
Yes.
Is that just for intellectual integrity, or did you really have a feeling that maybe there was something wrong?
So as I wrote before the recount started, I thought it was unlikely that fraud had changed the outcome. I thought it was a low probability that that was true. But given the stakes, don't you think even a low probability, if it's a relatively easy investigation to conduct, we ought to look into it and make sure?
I would expect an academic to say that. No, I'm
But no, I think this was about two things. It was about making sure so that we'll know, and we don't always have to be uncertain. And it's about creating a deterrent to someone attacking us next time. Unfortunately, the recounts that didn't take place it took place in very little of Pennsylvania and only half of Michigan. We've created a very weak deterrent and maybe even an invitation for people to attack us next time.
So we wasted some money, is what you're saying.
Well, I wish that the outcome had been that Jill Stein had paid Michigan for recounting instead of, and paid the cost, which she raised the money to do. But the law in Michigan, unfortunately, sets a statutory cost for recounting each precinct rather than asking the candidate to pay the actual cost.
Where did the money go that you raised?
The money that she raised is governed by EAC, by campaign finance rules, and the last I heard, the thinking was that whatever money is left over when all the legal bills are paid and the state recount bills are paid will be returned to the donors. But I'm not sure. I'm not absolutely sure what the final decision will be.
Being of the legal persuasion, attorneys have to eat too.
I don't blame them. I saw how hard they work fighting these cases in parallel. Yes?
So without looking at the paper ballots, is there any way to examine these machines to see if they have been hacked or if they've been hacked?
You can examine them. You can do a forensic examination on the machines. And basically take them apart, inspect the memory, look if there's any evidence that files have been changed or erased. That is extremely expensive because you need experts looking at each individual machine that you want to sample and inspect. And it's also less direct and less likely to give a definitive answer than just looking at the physical evidence, the paper ballots. That's a low-tech thing to inspect that gives a pretty definitive, the ballots match the results or not.
Does anybody use the mechanical machines?
No, not anymore. Yeah, no, we've gotten rid of those.
Countrywide?
Yes, I believe they're countrywide. They've been eliminated, which is good because those were actually pretty easy to hack too, but I can tell you about that after. Yes?
One question. We're talking about paper ballots and points of redundancy. Why wouldn't we, as a first step, have electronic redundancy? So in other words, have multiple software suppliers, and the only way that would create hash totals, let's say, and vote counts, and if let's say you run it through one, and then it automatically runs through another, they each use a different piece of software. Like right now we said there's two, but maybe we need more, and when those print out, if the hash totals aren't correct, and the who's a Dem, who voted Republican isn't correct, that might be a way to identify higher risk areas.
Well, I think that falls under this first bullet of trying to harden the technology too. But however much of that we do, there's always going to be some, and I think probably legitimate question about whether the bad guys were just smarter or luckier than we were. And we missed something in all of that hardening.
But I think
that's about raising the bar. The other is about proving the result.
Yeah, and that's why I think having different groups working on software that does the same thing but differently, they have to hack into all of them exactly the same, because if they don't hack in exactly the same, the numbers will be different, which should, pop out an edit. you would think,
Yeah.
at the clerk level, you know?
Yeah, so I'm all for taking technological steps to make software, to make the system harder to attack. In many ways, that's more expensive than just looking at the paper afterwards.
Okay.
Right? Because you need expensive experts to do all of that. You need sometimes to buy new equipment to do all of that. I just want to use the paper ballots we already have instead of throwing them away and pay for, in a typical election, I think for a tenth the cost or so of a full statewide recount, we can do an audit that will give us the same level, give us a nearly the same level of confidence.
Let me shift again a little bit.
Yeah.
If they have to recount, I wonder if they should have 2 levels of recount.
Mhm.
One is they take a different piece of software, run it through electronically, and then hand count. So then you just start seeing hand count was here, what we had was here, and then here's a different piece of software. Because each one, you have to, you know, it's like building a house, you know.
Yeah.
And each one of these, you know, the foundation is the first piece of software, and then, you know, you have to make sure it's plumb, you know what I mean?
Right,
And,
right,
and so if you use a different piece of software and then hand count, I just think that there needs to be, you know, what you're saying, hardening it by having a couple electronic solutions. So in other words, if they use software A, in order to recount, if they want to do it electronically, they have to use software D.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that would help identify along with hand count.
In fact, there are ways to use software to do a large portion of recounting the ballots and then just spot check the software. And I actually have a research paper about this from about 10 years ago that I can send you. But it's a good idea. You want to write a paper about that?
Can I get it on book on tape?
Yes.
One of the things that Tim Skubik's group talked about was the fact that the pollsters did not pick up on the number of people that stayed home. And that was a big thing in the Michigan scenario, that it would easily, by hundreds of thousands of votes maybe, made a difference. And I guess the basic question is, are pollsters learning anything from this thing? We also heard just recently a scenario that there's at least 19 credible reasons for why the thing turned out it did.
Yeah.
And because you're trying to scientifically figure that out, with 19 of them, it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
I don't know. What is the life of a pollster like?
I'm glad that is not my department, because that is not an easy job to make accurate predictions about how people are going to behave by sampling them beforehand. Fortunately, we have a much easier problem to solve in asking, well, what did people actually do on election day? Right, so we can reduce that problem in some ways to this problem, and at least ask for an actual count of the votes that were cast. Yes?
You mentioned the recount came up with a few votes that did change. How
Yes.
did that happen?
Well, it turns out that the machines, the scanners are not perfectly accurate, and there are a lot of reasons why they sometimes make mistakes. Maybe because the voter's vote was not marked completely, maybe because there was just that the ballot was inserted into the machine slightly off. I forget the figure, a few votes out of every 1,000 are misread. But fortunately, that error tends to be pretty random. So errors in one candidate's favor are canceled out by errors in the other candidate's favor. What we expect to see if there was massive fraud is a systematic deviation when we go back and recount.
What does the readers do if the vote is straight ticket, but then you mark somebody for a given office?
I believe that
it's rejected.
It's rejected, is that right?
Yes, you can do it.
I think your vote for the individual office overrides the ticket vote, but that's determined by state law. Okay, defer to you. Yes.
Do you see any signs yet that people are moving away from a postmortem of 2016 to preventive action for 2018, 2020?
Well, I think there are signs that people are starting to, yes. But I think we are all interested in this experience of what happened in this election and what can we learn from it and how can we have closure on it. Because I think many, many people continue to have doubt about the integrity of that. If nothing else, I think the recount adds some credence to the outcome that we've had. But yeah, I think the most important issue is what are we going to do next time to stop large-scale fraud from actually happening. I mean, this whole experience has made me much more worried, and I was worried before the 2016 election about the possibility of cyber attack, but this whole experience has made me much more worried. The extent of centralization that takes place behind the scenes, and the challenges to actually examining any of the physical evidence, which is the only solid safeguard we have against cyber attacks on the election system, all leaves me extremely worried. It's not a matter of if, but when we are going to have an outcome-changing cyber attack if we don't act. Yes?
Because you mentioned doing an audit instead of the whole.
Yeah.
How do you pick your sample for the audit?
At random. So there are different ways to do that. You can, but the most efficient thing to do is to audit individual ballots selected at random from across the whole state. In order to do that, you need a way to get computer records that commit to the contents of every physical piece of paper individually, which means you have to, but the mechanics of that are something that needs to be worked out with the election administration. But you can also just pick precincts at random to audit, as long as you pick enough of them, and then go and recount those individual precincts, you can get arbitrarily high statistical confidence. The interesting thing about that, though, is that if the election appears to be a landslide, you need to audit a lot less than you would need to audit if the election was decided by one vote. Right? So by setting a level of statistical confidence as your goal, you can perform an economically efficient, a cost-efficient audit, and just do the least work you need to in every outcome. Yes?
We're starting to see some analyses of the voting patterns of different groups and how they contributed or detracted from their candidates' prospects. Are there any works in progress you are aware of, either academic or more popular, that will be coming out, or authors we should look to for a dispassionate but hopefully technically accurate analysis of that wider phenomenon than just
of the voting phenomenon and so forth? Well, my field is computer science rather than the politics, so I don't want to speak too far away from what I know. But I think there are people in the politics department at U of M. I'd refer you maybe to my colleague Walter Mebane, who has done a lot of work looking at postmortems of elections to try to figure out what happened. Yes?
In the midst of, we're talking about an election, but by the whole of the conversation, our biggest enemy is ISIS, it's the computers.
The computers are not our enemy. The computer technology is great and it can help us a lot, but we need to use it intelligently. And sometimes we need to make sure, we need to do common sense quality controls to make sure the computers are behaving correctly and that they're not being used against us.
We can say that about everything.
Well, I think in most things we do that involve engineered systems, doing basic quality controls is pretty important. I can't say that about most engineered systems. You wouldn't want to buy a car from a company that didn't do any kind of quality controls on the assembly line. And I'm not sure why we want to trust election outcomes from a computer system where common sense quality controls are not being routinely performed. Thank you.
So how many of us learned a lot more than we knew? Yeah, thank you. Professor Haldeman, on behalf of the Wolverine Caucus and the UN Alumni Association, I'd like to present you with this gold Wolverine Caucus pin.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. Clementi. She would have introduced our speaker today, but she was caught in committee.
Yes, I was.
But now you see the legacy. Paul Clementi was here, and Kara, and their son Joseph, who is a student at the University of Michigan College of Engineering. So we're all set for the next generation. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today for this very important forum. There will be a video of today's presentation available in about 3 weeks, and it will be online at the University of Michigan Government Relations site as well. So we hope that if any of you want today's PowerPoint, or if there's anything we can do, please share that with us. And we look forward to seeing you again on March 28th. That's Tuesday, March 28th, when we'll be talking about urban education and the Detroit Public Schools. So until then, I hope you have a great February, spring. Thank you again.
Are you Angela? Yes.